Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 563 through 567, which will cover manga chapters 642 through 645. And these are the episodes where things for Hody and Fishman Island actually get interesting, and the debut of the Red Hawk is upon us. Alright, so synopsis. The Straw Hat crew and the new Fishman Officers continue to face off while Fukaboshi tells everyone the truth behind who and what Hody is, and the truth is a lot darker than anyone could have ever imagined. And with time running out, Luffy decides to channel his brother Ace and debut a move that'll set the world on fire. Alright, so differences. There are actually very few real changes in terms of the content in these episodes. However, many of the scenes are edited really strangely to the point where it does kind of affect the pacing and the flow of certain scenes because they get chopped up in a way that's really not optimal, and I talk a bit more in detail about this later in this podcast. But probably the biggest change is in the order in which the moments are told. So particularly with how they tell Hody's flashback much earlier in the episode 564, whereas in the manga, following the events of episode 563, they show the Straw Hats continuing to fight the officers. Then it gets to the point where Usopp makes his declaration that he'll take down Daruma in 3 shots. And then we get the whole thing with Fukaboshi's speech as well as Hody's flashback. But the anime gives us this moment before any of that stuff with the Straw Hats fighting off the officers. And so it kind of like jumps in, I guess if I were to put it simply, the way if the anime told this progression the way kind of how the manga does it, it would be episode 263 and then it would jump to 265 and then jump back to 264. That's the order in which the manga kind of tells it. Of course, there are a lot of things that are also within that are kind of mixed up as well. But yeah, it really gives this unsatisfying flow throughout all of these scenes, which is kind of unfortunate. But some of the actual changes, though. So in episode 564, we have that flashback where Hody and his officers are kind of talking around the table. And the moment where they talk about how the royal family was accepting humans and Jinbei joined the Shichibukai and all of that stuff where they're talking around inside their hideout in the Fishman district. This in the manga, they were actually having this conversation outside. And so I don't know why this was changed. I think it was maybe to cut down on animation costs so they didn't have to reanimate a whole new scene in a different environment. They could just use the one that they already animated. I'm pretty sure that's the reason why they did that. The other changes in 565, there's a scene where Usopp kind of cheers on Brook after the reveal of his freezing sword. But in the manga, this scene actually goes straight to where Usopp kind of just talks to himself and saying, I have to keep up with everyone with their new skills that they learned. And so, yeah, there's that one little scene where Usopp's kind of like screaming and hyping up Brook. That's a filler scene, which I don't mind. It's a good scene. And then the other change that I noticed was in 565, where Luffy, just before he uses Gomu Gomu no Red Hawk, he actually tries to hit him with a normal jet bazooka, which does nothing to him. And that's what kind of leads him into using the Red Hawk. However, in the manga, this is not in there. And in fact, he just goes straight to the Red Hawk. But those are all the changes that I noticed. So let's get into the episodes themselves. So like I mentioned, in the differences section, it's at this point the pacing of the episodes really start to take a hit. Like particularly episode 563, it doesn't even get to the episode title card till like the 7-minute mark. And even then it still takes like another minute or so till we actually see anything happen. But once we do, it flashes back a tiny bit to just before the Noah started crashing back down, where we catch back up with what happened in the plaza, starting with Jinbei and Sanji against Wadatsumi. And I'll be honest, I completely forgot that Wadatsumi is supposed to be a blowfish fishman until he started blowing himself up. And it's just wild to me, the scale of Wadatsumi, though, like how either of them can actually damage him, especially when he starts to blow himself up further. And Sanji, like, he's shown like the size of a small pimple on Wadatsumi's face. From here, we move on to Robin, where she finally gets a chance to shine a bit after she'd been kind of neglected in the last few episodes, as Hammond reappears with his human slave army acting almost like a celestial dragon, which is The ultimate irony here, showing that really these guys don't care about people or fishermen' rights. It's not the celestial dragon's evil and vile ways that bother them so much. It's that they aren't the ones on top perpetrating these evil acts. And given the chance that they would just supplant the celestial dragons and become them, and it just further shows how empty their ideals and cause really is, as we'll see later on in this episode with what Fukaboshi says. This image is certainly not lost on Jinbei, as he can't stomach seeing fishmen act like the very thing oppressing them for centuries, and asks Robin to free the humans, even at the risk of those humans turning on them. But in reality, I feel like it wouldn't have made a difference. They were already fighting them anyways, so it's basically like they were just fighting the same people. But this way, there's at least a chance that some of them might turn on Hammond and fight back. And which is what happens. Robin steals the keys and unlocks the slaves. However, there's one sort of logistical nitpick I have about this scene. There are only 4 keys shown on the key ring, yet somehow Robin was able to unlock like hundreds or at least dozens of these human slaves' collars simultaneously. Like, how did she pass the 4 keys around so quickly? Because it's not like she can duplicate the keys themselves. Now, I know this is a really stupid detail, but it's just something you think about when you're a nerd. But this is where Robin's true strength and terror can come from. Robin as a villain can honestly be terrifying. I feel like we only got a slight taste of her being a villain as Miss All Sunday during Arabasta, but when you look at her power set, and especially now, what she does to Hammond is both creepy and devastating. Like how she starts to sprout her entire body out of him, and there's nothing he can do while she just breaks him in half. It's all pretty unsettling from the perspective of the victim, which is why it's always so annoying that Oda doesn't really utilize Robin all that much in combat, because I feel like she is really strong, and her ability can be broken, especially if she ever learns armament haki. Like, imagine those arms with armament haki hardening. Pretty crazy. I do really like that moment where the slaves ask Robin why she helped them, and she responds that she couldn't refuse a request from a handsome man, meaning that Robin plus Jinbei, that shipping fan base, started here. And this would be an interesting and fun pairing, though. As the evacuation order goes out, one fun little Easter egg the anime adds is the octopus fish lady that's seen losing her luggage in the commotion of everyone panicking to evacuate. That is actually Octopako, the lady that shows up in Hachi's cover story that punches him and dumps him because Hachi gave the last of the takoyaki to the old man fish to save his village. Then we finally get back to where the last episode left off, where Fukaboshi reveals who Hody actually is, and the interesting wrinkle in this is that it turns out their entire conversation has been inadvertently broadcast all over the island and will continue to. This reveal is truly what kind of saves Hody a little bit in terms of a villain and a character, as well as the themes of this arc as a whole. Fukaboshi reveals Hody is solely the creation of just pure hatred. He and the other new Fishman Pirates never suffered at the hands of humans. Humans have never really done anything wrong to them. Their entire motivation and beliefs are rooted in nothing and empty, as Fukaboshi puts it. This was actually a really great moment to see, because as soon as you hear this whole, point of the arc and the story of Fishman Island kind of click into place. This is exactly what Fisher Tiger and Queen Otohime were so afraid of happening if they kept going down the path that they were going down. If all the current adults just kept spewing hate for humans because of all the mistreatment and things that they have done at the hands of humans, eventually there will come a moment in time where that sentiment will just become ingrained in the people to the point where they start to hate just to hate. And that becomes their identity and how they define themselves. And when that happens, the idea of peace or letting go of that hate becomes almost impossible, because now that means that you essentially are rejecting who you are. And what's most terrifying for someone like that, both for Hody and people like that in the real world, is that when you lose that reason to hate, you no longer have, or you feel like you don't have any purpose or meaning in your life, which is why they cling to it so desperately and try to keep that hate alive. Hody has no real ideals or values because he's ruled by this hate, and that's all he knows. He's not rooted in any sort of real experience. It's just an abstract concept, which is why, unlike Arlong, Hody just kills anyone, humans and fishmen alike. He doesn't have any sort of values, as terrible as Arlong was, at least he had a code. Hody doesn't believe in anything. All he knows is he hates humans, and that's it. That's all his life is, just an empty shell with no real substance to it. Oda, interestingly enough, even represents this with the new Fishman pirate Jolly Roger. Unlike most of the pirate crews that contain a skull that represents and exemplifies who they are as a captain and a crew, but instead the new Fishman pirates have a stick figure human with its head decapitated, showing that his crew and his identity is literally just hate and desire to kill humans. Interestingly and most intentionally, one of the few other Jolly Rogers not to be a face or a skull is the Sun Pirates that were also heavily featured in this arc. And this is, of course, because they similarly are not a crew based in the direction of Fisher Tiger himself, but from a concept, and this concept being freedom and what the sun represents to them as the freedom. And so their Jolly Roger is the sun because they're fighting for more so the idea of freedom than really one captain's dream per se. And this whole thing is such an important theme and lesson in real life, too, because that's what happens when you just start spewing hate just for hate's sake. It becomes ingrained in young people's mind as just a way of life rather than an experience that they can learn from. And it becomes infinitely harder to teach people to let go of that because it's not something that happened to them. Rather, it's a part of them themselves. And you can clearly see that this is relevant to the real world because there's during that brief flashback of Hody and his crew, there's a not so subtle reference to the KKK where, as young adults, Hody and his crew went around in hoods with torches going around terrorizing fish people that helped humans. Like I said, this idea and revelation does make Hody and Fishman Island a lot better because, ironically, it gives this arc way more to chew on in terms of just discrimination is bad. However, one thing I do have to mention, though, is earlier on, there's a filler that they added where they depict Hody and his crew almost getting kidnapped by human pirates, and Arlong saves them in the Fisher Tiger flashback. It kind of contradicts this whole concept, and this is why adding random fillers without knowing where it's going is always a risky proposition. But I feel like at that point, it wasn't that far ahead in the story that they should have known that this was going to be an issue. Anyways, Kagoshi then highlights another really important theme / idea that's been prevalent in several of One Piece's arcs, and kind of as a whole, and that's how views and beliefs affect the next generation, and how if left unchecked, it will rot and fester into the next generation of children. And I think what he's trying to say here is that these dark and terrible views aren't necessarily because they're not the result of any sort of injustice or bad experience. It just begins to become ingrained in them, and with each passing generation, it gets more and more extreme till you have someone like Hody. We saw something similar to this with the Goa Kingdom and its nobles during Ace, Luffy, and Sabo's flashback. When the Grey Terminal was set on fire, the kids there had grown up so detached from the world that they don't even consider the people of the Grey Terminal human and can't even comprehend the atrocities that they were actually witnessing in front of their eyes. And then you had kids like Stelly who almost reveled in the normal people's pain and suffering. This theme is then taken to an even greater extreme, obviously, with the Celestial Dragons, as they've had centuries of this cycle reoccurring over and over to the point where they truly believe that they are gods and that they can do any horrible thing to other people because it's their divine right, and their belief that they are better, and the disdain and hate that they have for others just gets amplified with every passing generation to the point where everything becomes just insanely rotten, and you kind of hear this sort of rhetoric being touted by Zeo later on when they talk about how it's their divine right to basically eliminate humans and to do whatever they want. And this is what Fukaboshi is talking about, and what Otohime and Fisher Tiger were so desperately trying to stop from happening to Fishman Island. Oda is trying to tell us with Fishman Island just how extreme things can get if hate is left unchecked. We can see this throughout our real world history, and to an extent, we're seeing it play out right before our eyes right now with these extreme displays of violence towards certain groups of people over the last few years, based in basically unfounded racist stereotypes, which is why it's important to do what you can, even if it's just a little, to educate and not spread hate. One quote that I really love from Fukaboshi here is that the dead take their regrets to the grave, so a grudge is an illusion that the living create and they alone cultivate it. It really is hard not to hold a grudge, even wanting revenge against someone that's wronged you, and especially on the level of murdering a loved one can be a hard thing to come back from, and I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling that way and grieving. But his point is that you can't let that feeling overtake you and blind you to everything else, or even perpetrating that same hate and violence towards someone else. Even after Fukaboshi requests to have Fishman Island reset to 0, considering that Fishman Island, with how rotten it's become, is a lost cause to him. And this is when we get our classic chills-inducing moment from Luffy, as he reassures him and everyone that he and his crew will save Fishman Island, as overtaken, the music begins to blare in the background, and that familiar yet amazing surge of like hype and hope begins to wash over you, that Luffy and the Straw Hats will save the day, and this is the moment where the tide will begin to turn. And I always love this moment in any arc, but especially in this one too, because of how hopeless it does seem to a lot of the people of Fishman Island and Fukaboshi. The counterattack begins with Frankie and Ikaros, and I know the Crunchyroll subs actually try to explain Ikaros's Icarus wings, but basically, wing in Japanese is tsubasa, but also spit in Japanese is tsuba. So it's a really bad wordplay on the two words in Japanese sounding somewhat similar. And unlike Zeo's gag, one gag I will never get tired of is Frankie's misleading attacks. In this case, he fires his Frankie fireball and Chopper gets all excited for it, but it turns out yet again that it's not the General Frankie that did it. It's Frankie himself popping out of the cockpit and shooting it out himself, which I don't know why I never grow tired of this stupid joke, but Zeo's joke just gets really old for me. But during that though, Chopper gets attacked by Dosun, and we get a really sweet and quite the significant character moment for Chopper as Zoro sees his heavy point for the first time and comments how the one form he had the closest to looking like a human has become even more monstrous, to which Chopper says that it doesn't matter anymore since that was originally to try and make friends, but now that he's got friends that accept him for who he is, he's willing to become any kind of monster if it's to help Luffy and the crew achieve their dreams. And oh my God, I absolutely love this moment for so many reasons. It brings Chopper's character growth full circle from his beginning of being scared of being viewed as a monster to being in such an accepting environment that he no longer feels self-conscious about how he looks. And the best part, though, is the fact that it's Zoro who has the first notice of this, as he has been kind of the most prominent sort of big brother figure to Chopper this entire time. And Zoro often is this stoic and seemingly uncaring, but it's moments like this that really reinforce the obvious fact that Zoro is a big softie and cares deeply for his crew and those he loves. All the while, Zoro just kind of casually breaks Hyozo's swords too at this moment, like it's nothing. And to hammer this point home even further, later towards the end of episode 565, and this is why I also don't like how they chop this moment up, it shows that Chopper's got another trick up his sleeve, as we learn that when he eats a Rumble Ball now, he turns into his Monster Point form, but he's got full control over it. And it'll be interesting to see if it still has the 3-minute time limit and whether he can transform back without being forced to. But it's great to see Chopper fully embrace his monstrous side. Now, unfortunately, this kind of wraps up Chopper's sort of character arc. And so for the rest of the series, he doesn't really have like too much in terms of like growth in his character, unfortunately, other than him sort of growing as a doctor and his sort of medical training. But as in terms of like his character growth, it kind of stops here, unfortunately. So often Chopper kind of gets relegated to more support later on as the series continues. Moving on, Brook finally gets a cool moment where he gets to shine as he fights Zeo, and I love how this fight starts off with the insane tonal shift of Zeo creeping up on Brook, ready for a sneak attack, but then it turns into this very casual tone as Brook just turns around and stabs where he hears sounds at the same time, with the same intensity of basically casually swatting a fly. And it's like, oh, there you are. Then proceeds to explain more about how his Yomi Yomi powers work, as not only does his powers originate from his soul to project himself and put himself back together, but also he can now call upon the cold from the land of the dead to infuse his attacks with ice now, which is completely badass. I always love ice-based attacks. And the funny thing is we know that Brook is this silly, lovable musician and actually very kind, but when you look at him from like the standpoint of the people opposed to him, Brook as an opponent has got to be terrifying, like a walking, talking corpse that wields a sword with magic powers and seemingly can't be killed because he's already dead. In any other context would make anyone shit their pants if they were fighting something like that. It was just, it was kind of a thought that crossed my mind when I got to this part of the story. And I personally don't really like how these few episodes are edited and broken and paced because it's just all over the place, kind of ruining the momentum of this whole section. In the manga, like I mentioned, everything kind of flows where the crew's fighting for the most part, all happening in one sequence. Then it moves on to Hody's flashback and Fukaboshi's plea. Then we get to go to where Luffy fighting Hody right after that, because obviously it flows from Hody's flashback to Fukaboshi's plea, then to Luffy blasting Hody. But in the anime, all this gets chopped up to bits, and we keep cutting away, and in between all of these, and some of the best moments are just like kind of stopped, and there's just no proper flow, and it's really unsatisfying to watch these several episodes because of the way they're edited. But enough whining from me. We get to probably the coolest attack Luffy has, but makes absolutely no sense, as canonically this is the first time he uses Gear Second and Armament Hardening in tandem to create an even more powerful attack that also serves as a tribute to his brother Ace, as he coats his arm with Armament Haki, and somehow he ignites his arm on fire and absolutely guts Hody with the new Gomu Gomu no Red Hawk. And this move was so mind-blowing the first time I read this. The name of the move is awesome. The move itself was really cool to watch, but also you're in shock wondering how the hell he even did that. And not only was he able to, light his arm on fire, but he did it while his arm was submerged in water. And I don't believe there has been in the story an explanation for how Red Hawk works. But here's my best theory. So Gear Second already generates a lot of heat due to the increased blood flow, hence the steam. I think with this new trained up body, he's able to handle more intense Gear Second power that pumps blood faster, allowing him to generate even more heat combined with armament hardening, protecting him from the fire that he generates. This combined with sort of the internal heat and the massive amount of friction with the speed of the punch is enough to cause it to ignite, maybe? Causing not only massive damage to the exterior of a body, but it looks like it does massive amount of internal damage, as we see some singeing on Hody's back as well as a result. And this is why I think it was a mistake to see the fillers have Luffy use Gear Second with hardening earlier, because this is the first time he does it. And it's a very significant moment. And it's like, I don't know, it just kind of takes it away because you saw, okay, he did use hardening and Gear Second earlier, but this is the true first time he does it. And it's special too because, yeah, he basically uses this to honor Ace, and it's sort of a remembrance of Ace in terms of him copying Ace's Hiken or Fire Fist, basically. After Hody goes down again, there's some hesitation among the Fishman army soldiers, but the officers begin to become even more fanatical as they talk up their divine right to superiority. But you also begin to see just how far gone they are as Zeo begins to talk about how there's victory and death as they themselves are trying to destroy the entire island, and it makes no sense anymore to anyone. As a result of seeing this, the kids begin to question who really are the bad guys and if humans really are as terrible as everyone says. But Madame Charlie steps in and tells the children to see with their own eyes what is unfolding in front of them. The point of this isn't necessarily to show whether fishmen are good or humans are bad, because it's never that simple. And in fact, just like that one adult fishman tried to say how historically humans have been bad for fishmen, but what they're seeing unfold in front of them is how there are truly and hateful, evil, and frankly crazy fishmen trying to destroy their home as well. And so, yeah, they need to kind of look to see and decide for themselves that, yeah, it's not as simple as good or bad. There are good humans and there are bad humans. And similarly, there are also bad fishmen and good fishmen. I did, however, chuckle at that one throwaway line where the kid is like, "Those are humans too?" And Charlie goes, "Well, there are a few strange ones mixed in there." And the camera goes to Chopper and Frankie immediately. I thought that was really funny. Also, if you notice that freeze frame where they show Chopper in that scene, he's got a rumble ball in his mouth, and that's where you actually see him chomp down on the rumble ball. So if you're wondering when he actually ate the Rumble Ball, it didn't actually happen off screen. It's right there. And then one of my more favorite moments towards the end of this episode is, of course, Brooke being one of those strange ones gets another awesome moment. And I love the moment where he lectures Zeo about death, as he's probably the foremost expert on death, having died once. And you really hear in his voice just how angry this kind of talk is making him. Brooke values life more than anyone, having lost his entire crew and his own life once. He knows just how empty death can be, having been lost alone in the Florian Triangle for 50 years. And just, you can see how much this angers him, saying like, oh, there's all this in death, when really, yeah, death, that's it. There's nothing. And to him, it's just kind of upsetting to hear someone talk about death so casually. But yeah, at this point, it seems like we're approaching the climax of the Fishman Island, as all the Straw Hats are basically gearing up to finish all these officers off. And Luffy is now getting ready to finish Hody off as well. But can they do it before the Noah comes crashing down? Because right now, it is in the bubble, but it's still floating down. The bubble wasn't necessarily to stop the ship. It was more so to give Luffy some footing so that he can defeat Hody. But we'll have to wait till the next episode to cover that. In any case, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and X account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates on when I post new episodes or see pictures of my manga collection. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. No spoiler section, but stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye!